Turn now, though, to Capitol Hill. Joining me now is Delaware Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who just a few hours ago joined the growing chorus of Democrats calling for Acosta's resignation. Senator, it's good to see you.
Good to see you, Casey.
So yesterday when we were initially talking about this, and I know you were talking to some of my colleagues, reporters in the hallways, the thinking was congressional oversight might be able to take care of this. But this chorus of calls for Acosta's resignation has really risen over the course of the last 24 hours. What made you think that this was the right step to call for him to step down?
Casey, the more I've heard about the arrest of Jeffrey Epstein and the vault full of inappropriate photos of underage women, and the more I've learned about the details of just how inappropriate this sweetheart plea deal was, that's more than a decade old but was carried out under the direction of Acosta, the more concerned I've become. Frankly, as I've heard more and more calls, not just for some oversight, but for some real accountability, the more I've reached the conclusion that he has lost the confidence of so many in my caucus that he can't continue to be an effective Secretary of Labor.
He has lost so many in your caucus, but frankly, the response from the Republican side of the aisle has been crickets, relatively. Mitch McConnell said he defers to the president here. We've talked to other Republicans in the halls who have essentially said, you know, it is up to the president to do something here. Why the divide? And is he going to stay labor secretary until Republicans decide that this is too much?
Well, this is another in many cases that I have found disturbing where the president has stood by and defended members of his core team or senior staff accused of sexual impropriety. I'll remind you, our president, when he was a candidate, was directly accused of sexual assault by a significant number of women. And so, frankly, what I find concerning here is the number of my colleagues who are not calling, at the very least, for more transparency and more accountability. There is going to be an Office of Professional Conduct review at the Department of Justice, but I'm not aware of Republican colleagues who are even calling for that review to be public and transparent so far.
You did say yesterday that you don't think that Acosta is going to be labor secretary for very long. What's your thinking behind that? I mean, what could push him out of his role in your view?
Well, perhaps I had underestimated just how hard President Trump would dig in and defend someone who was responsible for inking such an obviously inappropriate plea deal for a sexual predator. I can't believe I am still surprised by anything that President Trump does. But I had been assuming, given the early details I'd heard yesterday about Epstein's arrest and the underlying facts and the plea agreement, that he would be quickly headed for the exit. Now that President Trump is digging in and defending him, and relatively few of my Republican colleagues are speaking up, asking questions or raising concerns, he may be with us for the longer haul.
You have a legal background, and one of the things that the Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is calling for is a release of documentation and information from this review that was done of the plea deal. What do you think we could learn from that review? There seems in particular to be some questions around how Mr. Acosta treated the victims of Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about a ruling by a federal court holding that this plea agreement was inappropriate, in fact, that it violated federal law because of his failure to notify the victims here. But what there isn't much knowledge about yet publicly is exactly what information he had available to him as U.S. Attorney to charge Jeffrey Epstein with. I assume that where Secretary Acosta is going to go is saying that he got as strong a plea agreement as he could, given limitations in the information he had available to charge him with. I find that not particularly credible, given just how much information a Miami Herald investigative reporter, who I'll remind you has dramatically fewer prosecutorial and investigatory tools at her disposal than a U.S. attorney who has, FBI agents and a grand jury and a subpoena process that he could have used. So what we don't know is how strong a case Acosta had available to make at the time against Epstein. What we do know is that the plea agreement that was reached was inappropriate, in fact, violated federal law in terms of the lack of consultation with victims.
And we do know that incredible in quite a bit of the renewal of the focus in DOJ interest in this
Absolutely.
case. How hard, Senator, should Democrats fight to get him out? I mean, what tools do you have at your disposal?
Well, in the House, they have the ability in the Judiciary Committee to use compulsory service subpoenas to get witnesses to come and testify, and I suspect they likely will. One of my colleagues, Senator Blumenthal, has called for oversight into the relationship between Trump and Acosta and Epstein, regardless of whether Acosta leaves the cabinet. The larger issue here, really, Casey, is about rule of law. And I'll remind you, a very troubling development today that we're not talking about is the argument in front of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that was made in the case Texas v. U.S., where the Trump Department of Justice is not defending the Affordable Care Act, even though it was upheld by the Supreme Court. This could have a consequence for 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions who, if the Republicans, if the administration are successful in getting the court to overturn it, could really lead to a significant loss of coverage for millions of Americans.
It's definitely something we're absolutely paying attention to. Senator, big picture here with Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, the reality is, his only ties to prominent politicians in the United States, it's not just Donald Trump. He also has ties to Bill Clinton. He has ties to Prince Andrew in the UK. What does it say about our society that this is something that was allowed to continue and go on for so long with so much seeming, with it seeming to happen basically in plain sight?
Well, this is part of what the whole Me Too movement has been about, which is to finally blow the whistle on this kind of good old boy behavior where not just inappropriate or unseemly action, but in this case, actually criminal behavior, vulgar and repeated and longstanding abuse of children, human trafficking, sexual exploitation of teen and preteen girls was allowed to continue because of the influence and the reach of the relationships of this Mr. Epstein. I am very hopeful that he will finally face accountability and face a very long jail term after the actions of the U.S. Attorney in New York.
Senator Coons, quickly, before I let you go, you do sit on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I wanted to ask you about something else that has been quite the talk of the town here in Washington, and that is Kim Darroch, the ambassador from the UK, who obviously is very well connected both among the press and lawmakers here in Washington. Do you think he can continue to serve as an effective ambassador, considering what's happened? And do you have any concerns about the source of these documents and how they were leaked?
Well, Casey, as you know, the reason that a nation sends an ambassador overseas is to get a blunt and clear-eyed assessment about how a foreign government, whether an ally or an adversary, is functioning. And Sir Kim Darroch, the UK ambassador, certainly delivered a blunt assessment of the Trump administration. I think it's unfortunate that the leak of these confidential documents, these cables between the UK embassy here in Washington and the Home Office in London, is causing some challenges to our relationship. But the U.S.-UK relationship is very deep, very long. It's rooted in our shared values as well as our shared interests. And it's my hope that he'll be able to continue as ambassador. But if not, that this will not long harm what is one of the most important relationships in the history of the United States.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you very much. It's always great to have you on, sir.
Thank you, Chris.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.